narrate the incredible true story of RAF mechanic Sergeant Roderick Banks, the man who secretly modified Britain's legendary Mosquito bomber during World War II, begin with dramatic music and war sounds. We show the year 1943, RAF Marham Airfield, England. The Royal Air Force was fighting a desperate battle for air superiority over occupied Europe. The Mosquito, a twin-engine wooden aircraft, was already one of the fastest planes of the war, but one mechanic dared to make it even faster. Introduced Sergeant Roderick Banks, an ordinary RAF engineer with extraordinary skill. He was obsessed with speed. Against official regulations, Banks began illegal experiments on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines of Mosquito bombers. He secretly increased the boost pressure, fine-tuned the fuel mixture, and adjusted the supercharger timing far beyond factory limits. Pilots soon noticed the difference. Their planes were flying 20 to 30 miles per hour faster than standard Mosquitoes. They could now outrun German Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, even during the most dangerous missions deep inside Nazi territory. During Operation Jericho, the daring 1944 Amiens prison raid, these secretly tuned Mosquitoes stormed through enemy defences, destroying prison walls and escaping before German fighters could intercept. The operation became a legend, and no one knew that Banks's modifications had made it possible. Back in Germany, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring was furious. He shouted in disbelief, "They are made of wood, and still, we cannot catch them." Banks's workshop at RAF Marham became an underground performance centre. Fellow engineers followed his methods. Mosquito losses dropped by nearly half between 1943 and 1945. What began as one man's defiance became an unofficial doctrine of the RAF. End the story with emotional music. Show vintage Mosquitoes soaring through clouds. Narrate. Sometimes it doesn't take a general to change the course of war. Sometimes it takes one mechanic brave enough to break the rules. Display the text, the untold story of Roderick Banks, the secret mechanic who made the Mosquito unstoppable. In the shadow of World War II, when the skies over Europe burned with fire and courage, one man quietly changed the course of aerial warfare. Not from a cockpit, but from a small, oil-stained workshop deep inside RAF Marham. His name was Sergeant Roderick Banks, an aircraft mechanic whose passion for speed and defiance of the rulebook turned Britain's wooden wonder, the Mosquito, into one of the most feared aircraft of the war. It was 1943. The Royal Air Force was locked in a desperate battle for survival. Every night, Mosquito bombers darted over occupied Europe, wooden planes built for speed rather than armour, carrying out precision strikes, photo reconnaissance, and daring raids under the cover of darkness. The Mosquito was already fast, but not fast enough to outrun the latest German fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109s and the Focke-Wulf Fw 190s. Many never returned. Among the thousands of men who kept these planes alive was Roderick Banks, a mechanic known for his meticulous work, and his stubborn refusal to accept limits. While others followed manuals, Banks experimented. He had an instinctive feel for engines, especially the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant used in the Spitfire. But Banks believed the Mosquito's engines had more to give, if only someone dared to push them. Late one night, while the airfield slept, Banks stayed behind in his hangar. He began tweaking the boost control, the system that regulated air pressure entering the engine's supercharger. Regulations set strict limits to prevent engine failure, but Banks ignored them. He increased the boost, adjusted the fuel mixture, and fine-tuned the supercharger timing. When the engines roared to life, the sound was deeper, hungrier. He knew he had just crossed a line, but also that he had found something extraordinary. The next morning, the first test flight shocked the pilots. The Mosquito climbed faster, accelerated harder, and hit speeds no one thought possible. Word spread quickly among air crews. Take your plane to Banks's workshop. He'll make it fly like the devil. Soon, almost every Mosquito at RAF Marham carried Banks's secret modifications, and the results were astonishing. Crews reported that German fighters struggled to keep up. During raids over France, Luftwaffe pilots would dive on the Mosquito, only to watch it vanish into the clouds, gone before they could fire a single shot. In early 1944, the Mosquito squadron prepared for Operation Jericho, one of the most daring missions of the war. A low-level raid on Amiens prison in German-occupied France, where hundreds of French resistance members awaited execution. Flying barely 50 feet above the ground, Mosquitoes thundered toward the target. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracer rounds slicing through the air, but the bombers were too fast, too agile. The prison walls were shattered and more than 100 prisoners escaped. The Germans were stunned. The secret behind the success, Banks's illegal engine boosts, remained hidden, known only to a few. Back in Berlin, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring was furious. He reportedly exclaimed, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy." The British, who can afford aluminium better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory can build. And they give it speed, which I cannot begin to understand. Banks listened to this news with quiet pride. His workshop had become an underground performance centre where innovation thrived far from official eyes. Other mechanics began adopting his methods, and soon entire squadrons benefited from the upgrades. The statistics told the story. Between 1943 and 1945, Mosquito losses in combat dropped by almost 50%. The Royal Air Force never officially acknowledged his work during the war. To them, Banks was just another mechanic following orders. But among the pilots, he was a legend, the man who made their planes faster, their missions safer, and their survival more likely. Some even left small notes of thanks inside the engine cowlings before taking off. Cheers, Banks, for another ride through hell. When the war finally ended, the Mosquito stood as a symbol of British ingenuity and courage, a wooden aircraft that outperformed the enemy's best metal machines. And behind that success was one man's refusal to accept they're good enough. Roderick Banks had broken the rules, and in doing so, he had saved lives, changed RAF doctrine, and proved that sometimes true innovation is born from defiance. Because in the end, victory doesn't always come from generals or politicians. Sometimes it comes from a single mechanic. Working late in the hangar, covered in oil, chasing perfection one turn of a wrench at a time in the cold metallic silence of wartime hangars, Roderick Banks became a legend whispered among pilots and engineers. His hands, always stained with oil, worked with precision that defied the books written by engineers far removed from the front lines. Banks didn't just repair engines. He understood them, spoke to them, listened to the rhythm of their heartbeat. When he stood beside a Rolls-Royce Merlin, he could tell by the vibration alone whether it was breathing freely or struggling to deliver its full power. That instinct made him dangerous in the eyes of Superior, in the eyes of the airmen whose lives depended on speed. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was already an engineering masterpiece powering the Spitfire and Lancaster. But the version installed in the Mosquito, the Merlin 21 and later the Merlin 25, had strict performance limits. Restrictions meant to protect engines from overheating or seizing in combat. Banks looked at those limits not as protection but as wasted potential. The Merlin supercharger could compress air far beyond what the RAF manuals allowed. Banks realized that by adjusting the boost regulator, he could squeeze extra horsepower without catastrophic failure. If done with precision, he modified the boost control unit, disabling the standard safety valve that capped the manifold pressure. Then he experimented with fuel-air ratios, learning through trial and error that a slightly richer mixture could reduce knocking at higher pressures. He would listen carefully as the engine roared, feeling for that fine line between power and destruction. Every tweak carried risk. One wrong adjustment could mean a blown piston or a melted valve. Yet his deep understanding of the Merlin's temperament allowed him to walk that razor's edge with confidence. Word began to spread through RAF Marham like wildfire. Crews called him the magician. Some pilots swore that Banks's Mosquitoes could outclimb and outrun anything in the sky. They began to request his attention before missions, often bribing him with cigarettes or rations just to have him look over their engines. Soon, Banks's hangar became an unofficial testing ground. He would tune engines under the cover of night, recording each result in a small, grease-covered notebook. To him, this was not defiance. It was duty. The men who flew those planes deserved every possible chance to make it out. The impact of his modifications showed in the skies over France and Germany. German pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf-109 GS and FW-190s began reporting strange encounters. British bombers that seemed faster than physics should allow. One Luftwaffe pilot even described a Mosquito that had climbed like a fighter and vanished into the clouds before he could fire. These reports reached German high command, and confusion turned into frustration. Hermann Goering himself ordered an investigation into why the Luftwaffe could not intercept what he mockingly called those wooden monsters. Meanwhile, in England, Banks continued his quiet rebellion. He learned to calibrate engines individually for each aircraft, accounting for slight differences in weight, aerodynamics and altitude performance. His most daring modification involved the intercooler system, a network that cooled the compressed air before it entered the cylinders. By redirecting coolant flow and improving airflow efficiency, he prevented overheating even at dangerously high boost pressures. This meant pilots could maintain full throttle longer during evasive maneuvers or climb. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Andrew Collins, later recorded a night mission over Berlin where his Mosquito was chased by 3 FW-190s. He pushed his throttles fully forward, expecting to lose power within minutes. Instead, the engines howled stronger than ever, propelling his plane past 400 miles per hour at low altitude. It felt like the aircraft was alive, he said. Whatever Banks did to that Merlin, it made us untouchable. Such results didn't go unnoticed. Senior officers began to question how Marham squadrons were achieving unusually high survival rates. When an inspection team arrived, Banks hid his modified parts under a pile of scrap metal. Official reports listed exceptional maintenance quality as the reason for improved performance. No one dared admit that much of it was due to one man's quiet disobedience. Banks knew the risks. If caught, he could have been court-martialed for unauthorized modification of government equipment. But his focus never wavered. He often said to his fellow mechanics, if they fly faster and come home alive, then it's worth it. Those words became a silent creed among the ground crew. By late 1944, his methods spread beyond Marham. Other bases copied his techniques in secret, using notes passed between trusted engineers. RAF leadership eventually began testing higher boost levels officially, validating what Banks had already proven in the field. What started as an act of rebellion quietly evolved into policy. For Banks, recognition never mattered. He was content watching Mosquitoes lift off into the dawn, their engines roaring with a deeper, stronger tone. To him, each takeoff was a promise kept, a machine perfected, a crew given a better chance to return. The war would end, but his legacy was already sealed in the hearts of those who flew his creations. Years later, when veterans gathered to remember the wooden wonder, stories of a quiet mechanic from Marham resurfaced. They spoke of a man who risked everything not for glory, but for performance. Pilots remembered him as the soul of the Mosquito, the unseen hand that gave wings to the impossible. And even though official histories rarely mention his name, Roderick Banks became a symbol of the spirit that defined the RAF: courage, ingenuity, and the will to push beyond limits. His story reminds the world that sometimes victory isn't written by those who lead the charge, but by those who stay behind, covered in grease, listening to the heartbeat of an engine that could change the course of war. The winter of 1944 was bitter, both in weather and in war. The Allies had begun to push deep into occupied Europe, but German resistance was fierce. Each mission for the Mosquito squadrons meant flying into the teeth of danger, radar-guided flak, deadly night fighters, and the constant fear of engine failure far from home. Yet among these crews there was a new confidence, almost a quiet arrogance. They trusted their planes more than ever, and they trusted the man who had given them that edge. Roderick Banks. Pilots described the feeling of sitting in a Mosquito modified by Banks as flying a living creature. The engines responded instantly, the throttle smooth and powerful. Even at high altitude, where the thin air often choked other planes, the Merlin sang with strength. Banks's subtle tuning allowed the superchargers to keep delivering full power, giving the Mosquito an advantage in climbs and dives. For pilots flying deep penetration missions into Germany, every extra knot of speed was a lifeline. One night in December 1944, a crew from No. 627 Squadron, pilot officer David Moffat and navigator Peter Lawson, took off from RAF Marham for a bombing raid on Hamburg. The weather was terrible. Icy winds swept across the airfield and visibility was almost zero. As they crossed the Dutch coast, radar picked up incoming German fighters. Within minutes, the dark sky erupted in chaos. Two FW-190s closed in fast, their cannons spitting orange fire. Moffat pushed the throttles forward, feeling the engine strain. But this Mosquito was different. It didn't strain, it surged. The aircraft leapt forward as if pulled by an invisible hand, at speed climbing beyond the limits printed in the manual. Moffat later told his debrief officer, "It felt as though the engines wanted to fight more than we did." He escaped into the clouds, flying home with both wings peppered by flak but engines still humming strong. When he landed, he went straight to Banks's workshop. Without a word, he left a single bottle of scotch on the mechanic's bench, an unspoken thank you that every pilot understood. Across Europe, similar stories echoed. Mosquito crews were now flying missions other bombers couldn't even attempt. They raided Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen and Oslo, flew lightning-fast strikes on communication hubs, and photographed enemy bases before dawn. The Germans tried everything: faster interceptors, radar traps, even night fighter ambushes, but the Mosquitoes simply outran them. Every successful mission carried a trace of Banks's craftsmanship. For Banks himself, the satisfaction came not from praise but from the hum of an engine perfectly balanced. He rarely saw the men he helped, except when they returned to shake his hand or share a nervous laugh before takeoff. Many didn't come back, and those losses haunted him. On quiet nights after the hangars emptied, he would sit by the open engine cowlings, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. Like a heartbeat fading away, he would whisper, "Next time, we'll make it faster." There were moments when the strain of secrecy weighed on him. The higher command still didn't know the full extent of his modifications. Rumours spread, but no one could prove anything. Officially, the Mosquito's boost pressure limits were 18 pounds per square inch. Unofficially, Banks had pushed some engines safely to 25. Those few extra pounds made all the difference between life and death in combat. The pilots who flew his machines called it a Banks power. During Operation Clarion in early 1945, a massive low-level assault on German transportation networks, the Mosquito squadrons became legends. Dozens of Banks-tuned aircraft roared over railways and bridges, flying so low that they scattered the snow beneath them. Not one aircraft from Marham's modified fleet was lost that day. When reports came in, Banks didn't boast. He simply smiled, cleaned his tools, and prepared for the next mission. As victory drew closer, whispers of his work began to surface at command level. A few senior engineers visited Marham to inspect his workshop. They were astonished to find no secret equipment, no hidden machinery, just precision, intuition, and a notebook filled with numbers, sketches, and personal calculations. Banks explained his process humbly, describing how he tuned each engine by ear and vibration rather than by factory specification. One officer reportedly said, "You've done what Rolls-Royce engineers only dreamed of," but Banks didn't take it as praise. He simply nodded and went back to work. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, celebrations echoed across every airfield. For Banks, it was a quiet day. He spent it walking along the runway, watching the Mosquitoes lined up in perfect symmetry, their engines silent at last. The men cheered and drank, but he stood in reflection. So many of those planes had carried friends who never returned. He had given them speed, but speed couldn't always outfly fate. Still, deep down, he knew his work had mattered. The RAF post-war analysis later showed that Mosquito survival rates were significantly higher than any other Allied bomber. Engineers examining recovered aircraft found evidence of modified boost systems and advanced fuel settings that matched Banks's handiwork. What had once been considered reckless now became a cornerstone of future engine development. Years later, a pilot who had served under him said in an interview, Banks didn't fight the war with guns or bombs. He fought it with courage and a wrench. It was the perfect tribute to a man whose genius never sought glory, only results. Though his name never appeared in the official history books, his influence lived on in every innovation that followed. The lessons learned from his defiance helped shape the next generation of aircraft, the jet age that dawned soon after. And so Roderick Banks faded quietly into history. His legacy carried not in medals or parades, but in the echo of engines that once tore through the clouds over Europe. Faster, stronger, freer, because one mechanic dared to believe that rules were meant to be rewritten in the name of survival. When the war ended, the roar of engines was replaced by silence. The skies that had once trembled with thunder now carried only the quiet hum of peacetime. RAF Marham, once alive with urgency and the smell of aviation fuel, stood calm under the English sun. For many, the war had ended in victory, but for men like Roderick Banks, victory was complicated. He had won his own battles in the shadows, tuning machines instead of firing guns, saving lives one engine at a time. Yet as medals were handed out and heroes were decorated, Banks's name was nowhere to be found. He returned to his workshop as if nothing had changed. The same tools, the same scent of oil, but the war that had given his work purpose was over. The RAF no longer needed secret performance tricks. Peace demanded order, discipline and procedure once more. The illegal modifications that had kept so many men alive were quietly brushed aside. Official documents referred to them only as field deviations, and Banks himself was reassigned to standard maintenance duty. But among the pilots who had flown his Mosquitoes, his legend refused to die. Whenever two veterans met, in pubs, reunions or dusty air museums, the name Roderick Banks always surfaced. They would tell stories of that night over Berlin, or the time they escaped a swarm of German fighters by opening up the Banks throttle. They laughed, they toasted, and they remembered. To them, Banks wasn't just a mechanic. He was the unseen guardian who had flown with them on every mission. Banks himself remained humble. He never asked for credit, never tried to defend his wartime defiance. When younger mechanics at Marham asked about his achievements, he would shrug and say, "We just made the engines do what they wanted to do." That simple line, spoken in his calm Norfolk accent, carried a depth of genius that few understood. In the early years after the war, Rolls-Royce engineers began revisiting the data from field modifications. They noticed that many engines from Banks's squadrons had operated safely at pressures thought impossible in factory testing. These discoveries influenced later Merlin derivatives and even early jet engine fuel systems. Quietly and without acknowledgement, Banks's experiments shaped the engineering future of the RAF. Time moved on, and technology evolved. The Mosquito, once the fastest aircraft in the sky, was retired. Jet fighters replaced the wooden wonders, and airfields that once echoed with warbirds became silent museums. Roderick Banks continued to work for the RAF until his retirement in the early 1950s. When he left, there was no ceremony, just a handshake from his commanding officer and a letter of thanks for exemplary service. He folded the letter neatly and tucked it away in his toolbox, the same one he had carried through the war. He settled in a small cottage not far from Marham, where he spent his days restoring old motorcycles and helping neighbours fix their engines. To the locals, he was just a Roddy, the quiet old mechanic who could make anything run better. Few knew that this unassuming man had once changed the fate of aircrews across Europe. It wasn't until decades later, in the 1980s, the military historian researching Mosquito operations stumbled upon records that mentioned unauthorized field boost modifications. The engineer behind them was listed only as SGT. R. Banks, intrigued, the historian began interviewing surviving pilots, many of whom vividly remembered Banks and his miracle. One pilot, now in his 70s, described him with tears in his eyes. "We didn't know what he did, but we knew we could trust it with our lives." The story slowly resurfaced. Air museums began adding notes about Banks's contributions to Mosquito exhibits. Aviation magazines published articles calling him "other secret mechanic." For the first time, the name Roderick Banks appeared in print not as a footnote but as part of the legend itself. When the RAF Museum at Hendon unveiled a restored Mosquito, one former pilot placed a small plaque inside the engine cowling. It read, "For Sergeant Roderick Banks, who made her fly like the wind." By then, Banks was an old man, living quietly, his hearing dulled by years of engines. When a journalist visited to interview him about his wartime work, he smiled faintly and said, "I only did what needed to be done. The boys were flying into hell. I just wanted to give them wings fast enough to get out." His eyes, still sharp beneath his wrinkled brow, carried the calm certainty of a man who had long ago made peace with his choices. In his final years, he would sometimes visit airshows, standing among crowds watching restored Mosquitoes thunder past. The sound of those twin Merlins still stirred something deep inside him. Once, after a flyover, a young pilot approached him, unaware of who he was, and said, "They say the Mosquito was unbeatable." Banks simply nodded and replied she was if you treated her right. When Roderick Banks passed away, the news didn't make headlines. But among the community of pilots, mechanics and aviation enthusiasts, his death felt like the closing of a chapter in British history. Those who knew his story shared it again and again, of a man who defied orders not for glory, but for the survival of others. His tools and notebooks were later donated to the RAF Museum. Inside one grease-stained page, written in fading pencil, were the words, "Speed isn't about numbers, it's about hope." And perhaps that was his greatest legacy. Not the engines he tuned nor the planes he saved, but the spirit of ingenuity and courage he left behind. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are not those who fly into battle, but those who make it possible for others to return from it. The last days of Roderick Banks's life were spent in peace, surrounded by the quiet hum of memory. The sound of engines had faded, but in his mind they still roared across the skies of Europe. The deep growl of twin Merlins, the vibration under his feet, the faint scent of fuel that never truly left his hands, every sound carried a story. Every vibration reminded him of faces, young, fearless pilots who had trusted his machines more than their own luck. He would sometimes sit in his small garden at dusk, looking toward the horizon as the setting sun painted the sky in amber and red, the same colours he used to see reflected off the Mosquito's polished wooden skin. Neighbours who visited found him gentle, soft-spoken and modest. Few ever learned that this quiet old man had once been the reason hundreds of British airmen came home alive. In his heart, he knew that recognition wasn't what mattered. The real victory had been survival, not just of machines, but of men. When the war was at its darkest, when the Luftwaffe owned the night and death waited in every cloud, he had refused to accept that the Mosquito's best had already been achieved. That defiance, that stubborn, brilliant refusal to settle was what had made the difference. Banks often said engines are like people, push them right and they'll surprise you. To him, machines weren't just metal and fuel, they were living things capable of greatness when treated with respect. He believed that every bolt, every screw carried responsibility, that the mechanic's hand was as much a weapon as the pilot's trigger. After his death, his name began to spread quietly through aviation circles. Historians pieced together his work. Veterans shared fading photographs, and his story became something larger than just a footnote. It became a symbol of unsung genius. Documentaries began mentioning a mysterious RAF mechanic who modified engines beyond regulation. Books about the Mosquito included paragraphs describing a Banks's boost settings, which engineers now confirmed were decades ahead of their time. His old workshop at RAF Marham was eventually restored as part of a museum exhibit. The smell of oil and wood polish still lingered there, almost as if he had just stepped out for a moment. Visitors could see his original notebook, the one with hand-drawn diagrams, scribbled formulas and smudged fingerprints. On the cover, faded and barely legible, were 4 words. "We can go faster." Those words became his legacy, a motto that transcended machines. They represented the essence of innovation, the spirit to push boundaries even when told not to. Engineers, pilots and dreamers alike began quoting him in lectures and interviews. One aviation historian wrote, "Roderick Banks did not invent the Mosquito's speed, he revealed it." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, surviving Mosquito pilots gathered for a reunion. Among the speeches and stories, one veteran stood up and raised a glass. His voice trembled as he said to Sergeant Roderick Banks, "The man who gave the Mosquito her wings." The crowd fell silent, then erupted in applause. For a moment it felt as if Banks was there with them, smiling quietly in the corner, his eyes gleaming with pride. That night, as vintage Mosquitoes performed a commemorative flyover, the engines thundered through the sky, tuned to perfection as if his spirit still guided them. The sound rolled across the fields of England like a heartbeat from another time. The pilots looked up and some whispered his name. Today, his story lives not only in museums and archives, but in the hearts of those who believe that greatness doesn't always wear a uniform or stand in the spotlight. It often hides in the quiet corners, in workshops, in hangars, in the steady hands of people who believe that perfection can always be improved. Roderick Banks's life is a reminder that history isn't written only by generals or kings. It's written by the forgotten minds who dared to think differently, by those who worked in silence while others claimed the glory. His defiance didn't just make planes faster, it made hope strong. The Mosquito became a legend because it broke the rules of what an aircraft could be, light, wooden and deadly fast. And Banks was the soul of that legend, the man who turned an already brilliant machine into something unstoppable. He didn't just change engines, he changed outcomes, rewriting the limits of engineering and the shadow of war. If you listen closely to the sound of a restored Mosquito today, you can almost hear his fingerprints in its rhythm, that perfect harmony between power and purpose. Each roar of the Merlin engine carries his name echoing through time as a testament to courage, creativity and quiet rebellion. And in that sound, somewhere between history and eternity, the spirit of Roderick Banks still flies, forever chasing speed, forever defying limits, forever proving that one man's passion can lift an entire world above the storm.